The Secret of the Old Mill, Chapter 6. The Old Mill. Mr. Stummers, a lanky, stumbling old farmer, with drooping shoulders, a drooping mustache, and a droopy pipe, was just coming in from the fields when the boys came through the barnyard gate. How he managed to chew a straw and smoke a pipe perpetually at the same time was always a fascinating mystery, but he could do it and always seemed to derive a great deal of satisfaction from the feat, stopping only to change the straw or fill the pipe at intervals. Some people had been known to have seen him without the straw, and some had been known to see him without the pipe, but no one had ever seen him without one or the other. Chet Morton always stated it as a grave fact that Carl Stummer slept with his pipe in his mouth and a supply of fresh straw constantly by his bedside, and that he changed them in his sleep. "Oh, boys," he called, taking a firm grip of his pipe stem. "And what brings you here?" "How's the cherry crop, Mr. Stummers?" asked Frank. "Fair to middlin'," replied Mr. Stummers doubtfully. This was a good sign, as Carl Stummers was rarely known to express an encouraging opinion about anything. If he said crops were poor, one might be reasonably certain that they were really fair. If he said they were fair to middlin', it might be interpreted that they were excellent. "Mother wants to know if you can let her have cherries to can this year." Mr. Stummers chewed with relish at the straw. "Most probably she can," he agreed. "She wanted to speak for them so that you would keep her in mind at cherry-picking time." "I'll remember," promised Stumner. "Mrs. Hardy has always been a good customer of mine. You tell her she can have all of them cherries that she wants." "Thanks, Mr. Stummers. That's all we called about." The farmer looked at them. His hands were plunged deep into his pockets of his faded overalls. The straw waggled beneath the drooping mustache. "Out for a hike?" he ventured. "Yes. We thought it would be a good day for it." "Yeah, pretty fair day for hiking," he agreed, glancing at the sky to make sure. "Where are you thinking of going?" "Oh, we don't know. Just around the country." "Yeah? Not going down by the old mill, are you?" "Turner's old mill?" asked Joe. "Down by the deserted road?" "That's the place, down by the river." "Well, we hadn't thought particularly about going down there. Why do you ask?" The straw waggled more vehemently than ever. Mr. Stummer took a long drag at his pipe, which was in imminent danger of going out. "Oh, dunno," he said, with a reflective sigh. "Just thought I'd say something about it. I wouldn't go down there if I was you." "Why not?" inquired Frank. "I know the place is deserted, and it's almost falling down, but we can keep out of danger, can't we?" "It ain't deserted now." "What do you mean?" "There's 3 fellows running the mill now." "Funny fellows they are. Been there for a couple of weeks." The boys looked at one another in surprise. Turner's flour mill was located on a wild part of the Willow River. It had once been on the main road, but the construction of a new highway had left it on a deserted loop, which was now seldom traversed. The mill had been abandoned for several years and seemed to have outlived its usefulness. No one had ever expected that the mill wheel would turn again. "Are they running it as a flour mill?" asked Frank. Stummer nodded. "They don't do much outside grinding. I sent 'em some of my wheat, but their prices was too high. They nearly skinned me alive, so they don't need to expect any more trade from me. I'll send my grain into Bayport after this, where I've always been sending it." "How do they expect to make a living, then?" "They ain't looking for trade from the farmers. Matter of fact, I don't think they want it. They told me they're getting up some new kind of breakfast foods that the doctors are all going to take up." "There's something secret about it," went on Stumner, warning to the mystery. "They ain't saying anything until they get their patents. Why, they won't even let a man go through the mill." "3 men, you say?" "Yeah, 3 fellas. Sorta unpleasant-looking chaps. And there's a boy there, too. I forgot about him. Looks something like you," he said, pointing to Joe. "Have you ever seen any of them before?" Stumner shook his head. "I guess they come from the city," he hazarded. "They come away down here as they could be quiet and work at this here breakfast food stuff of theirs without being bothered. That's why I said you shouldn't go down there. They don't like people hanging round." "Makes me curious to see the place," put in Jerry. The other boys gave murmurs of agreement. "Go along if you like," said Stumner, shrugging his shoulders. "It ain't none of my affair. Just thought I'd let you know. That's all. They don't like strangers round." "We won't bother them," promised Frank. "What do you say, fellows? Should we take a trip round that way, or should we not?" As usual, the mere fact that something of a mystery surrounded the old mill made all of the boys eager to turn their steps in that direction. "We'll go down the old road anyway," said Joe. "I'd like to get a look at the place. It'll give us somewhere to go." "Sure," agreed Phil. "We can eat our lunch on the way." "The vote seems to be in the favor of it," said Frank with a smile. "Well," drawled Stumner, chewing vigorously at the straw, "don't blame me if you get chased away from the mill. I've warned you." His eyes twinkled. His whole purpose in telling the lads of the mystery that surrounded the mill had been to send them in that direction, for he realized the attraction the place would have for the boys when they knew that the mill was running again. He was rather curious, too, about the 3 men who were in charge of the place. He thought that perhaps the boys might pick up some information that he had been unable to get. "Have a good hike," he said as he turned to go back to the farmhouse. "Don't get into any trouble." "We won't," they assured him, and forthwith started back down the lane. They met Chet, who had by this time managed to retrieve his belongings and was trudging along in the dust, meditating ways and means of getting even with his companions. He was not vindictive, and he had taken the joke in good part, grinning cheerfully as he saw them approach. "Think you're pretty smart, don't you?" he said in mock restraint as they came near. "I've got so many thistles in my foot, you'll have to carry me home now." With that he began to limp in an exaggerated manner, as though he had been completely crippled by his efforts to regain his socks and shoes. "We wouldn't carry you to the end of the lane," said Frank promptly. "You'd better keep your feet moving if you want to come with us." "Where are you going?" "Down to the old mill. Stumner tells us the place is running again." "Hooray!" shouted Chet. "I'll race you." And forgetting all about his tenderfoot soles, he led the crowd in a mad race towards the main road. Chapter 7. In the Mill Race. An hour later, the Hardy boys and their chums reached the vicinity of the old mill. They had lunch in the shade of the trees along the deserted road, and it was early in the afternoon when they arrived at the top of the hill that overlooked the river. The old mill was a sturdy structure that had once been strong and imposing, but was now weather-beaten and showed the ravages of the years. The mill wheel turned slowly, creaking painfully, as though it objected to being forced to labor again after its long rest. Outside the front door they could see 3 figures, 2 men and a boy. At that distance it was impossible to distinguish their features, but as the lads descended the hillside and drew closer they saw that the men were middle-aged fellows, far from reassuring in appearance. Because of Stumner's remarks, the Hardy boys and their chums took good care to keep to the shelter of the bushes as they went along the abandoned roadway, now overgrown with weeds and undergrowth. Their approach was not noticed, and at last they were standing not more than 100 yards away from the mill, effectively concealed by the trees and shrubs. "I don't like the looks of the men," remarked Frank in a low voice. "Neither do I," agreed Joe. One of the men was apparently about 50 years of age. He had a dirty graying beard, and he wore spectacles. He was clad in a torn and stained pair of overalls with a shirt rolled up at the elbows. For a miller, "There mighty little flour on his hands," commented Frank. "He looks more like an automobile mechanic. What's all that black stuff all over his arms?" The other man, who looked older, was similarly attired, and he was of a more benevolent appearance. He did not wear glasses, and his shaggy brows almost hid a pair of keen, sharp eyes. He touched his long white beard reflectively as the other men talked to him in a low tone. The boys could not overhear what the pair were saying, but they saw the boy, a fair, curly-headed youth of about 15, in ragged clothing, look up at the older man and say something to him. Instantly the old fellow lost his look of benevolent reflection. He gave the boy a cuff on the ear that almost staggered him. "Be off with you," he ordered harshly. "Go away and play. Don't be hanging round here while we're talking." He spoke so loudly that his words could be clearly heard by the lads hidden in the bushes. The curly-headed boy stood his ground and evidently repeated what he had said before, for the old man at once became furious. "Go away and play, I tell you," he shouted in a shrill tone. "I'll call you when I need you, and be sure you come in a hurry when you hear me." He reached behind him for a heavy cane that was leaning beside the doorway, and he struck out viciously at the lad with it. But the boy dodged the blows and ran off towards the mill race, while the old man watched him go, muttering imperceptibly. "Leave him alone," said the other man in a guttural voice. "We've got other things to attend to than that brat. He's a nuisance. I'll whale the hide off him when he comes back. Leave him alone. Markle is waiting for us. Let's go inside." All right," muttered the old man peevishly. He turned and followed the other through the doorway. "Nice-tempered old chap," remarked Jerry, when the pair had disappeared into the mill. "I'll say he is," declared Joe. "I don't think either of them is up to much." "The young fellow looks all right," Chet said. "He looks as if he has a sweet life here with those men." Phil said, "I thought Stummer told us that there were 3 men running the mill." "They said something about Markle," Frank pointed out. "Here's the man who is waiting for them inside the mill. That might be the other partner." "Let's go up and talk to the kid," suggested Joe. "Perhaps we can dig something out of him about those men. They don't seem to treat him very well anyway." The boy was walking along the side of the old mill race. The waters were very swift at this point, where the current was strong and the river was deep. The boy was trudging along the weather-beaten planks with his hands in his pockets, looking very disconsolate. "Lonely-looking boy," observed Tony. "They told him to run away and play. He looks as if he'd never played in his life." "We'll go over and talk to him," Frank decided. "If those old chaps say anything to us about being around here, we'll ask them to quote some price on having something ground." "I can do that," exclaimed Chet. "Dad's a farmer, and he's often said he wished the old Turner mill was running again, so he wouldn't have to haul his grain so far." The boys emerged from the bushes and crossed the weed-grown open space near the front of the mill. The other lad had not yet seen them. He was standing by the mill race, some distance below, gazing into the water, now and then raising his head to look at the clacking wheel that turned monotonously in showers of dripping water. "I'm curious about this patent food story," Frank said. "It's odd there wasn't anything in the papers about it. Nobody except the farmer, like Stummer, seems to have heard about the mill being taken over." "Oh, probably they want to keep it to themselves until everything is ready," Jerry pointed out. "I'll bet you're beginning to see some kind of mystery in this already, Frank. Chances are we'll just get kicked off the premises for our pains." "Oh, I don't think there's any mystery about it," said Frank with a smile, "but I'm just curious to know what it's all about." "No law against that," Phil agreed. "If this breakfast food invention of theirs turns out to be something wonderful that makes all our lives about 20 years longer, we can say we were among the very first to know about it." By this time, they had drawn closer to the mill race, and the boy standing there had raised his head and seen them. He was a good-looking fellow, not unlike Joe Hardy in appearance, as Carl Stummer had pointed out, but his face was pinched and drawn, and there was a melancholy expression in his eyes. "Looks as if he hasn't had a square meal in a month," Jerry remarked. The boy turned and began to move toward Frank and Joe. He had gone only a few paces, however, when they saw him suddenly stumble. He had stepped upon a loose stone that had rolled from beneath his foot. He wavered uncertainly, striving to regain his balance. Then, with a shrill cry, he toppled over into the mill race and fell with a splash in the swift, rushing torrent of water. "Help!" he shouted in terror. "Help!" Chapter 8. Joe's Courage. The accident had happened so quickly that it was not for a few moments that the Hardy boys and their chums realized the lad's danger. Then, as they saw him struggling in the torrent, they began to run towards the spot to which the lad was beginning rapidly carried away. Joe was in the lead, and as he ran he was taking off his coat. Just below the mill race, the river was full of rocks, and the rapids dashed over them in a boiling fury of spray and foam. If the youth were ever swept into the rapid, he would be doomed. The other lads were not far behind Joe. The accident had not been seen from the mill, for no one appeared in the doorway, and the cries of the boy in the river evidently had not been heard by the men in the building. "Help!" he was shouting. "Help!" He was struggling in the water, being swept briskly on towards the deadly rapids. "I can't swim!" Joe reached the bank, paused to kick off his shoes, then stood poised for a moment above the rushing waters. He dived into the mill race, disappeared beneath the surface, and then rose just a few yards away from the struggling boy. The lad had already gone under once, and was gasping for breath. He was just about to go under for the second time when Joe swam towards him with strong, steady strokes and grasped him by the collar. Frantically, the boy tried to seize his rescuer, but Joe was ready for that. He knew that the unreasoning grip of a drowning person is of the utmost danger, so he managed to stay at arm's length and at the back of the boy. "Hold steady," he shouted above the roar of the waters. "Hold steady, keep cool." His words had some effect in restoring the lad to his senses, and the boy, feeling the supporting grasp of his collar, ceased his struggles. But the danger was not yet over. The current was so strong that they were both being carried headlong downstream towards the rapids. Joe could see the jagged rocks silhouetted against a background of flying spray and foaming waters. If once they were swept into that, they would be battered to death. He was handicapped by the weight of the boy, but he turned towards the shore and exerted all his efforts in swimming towards the bank. But he made little progress. The current was too strong for him. The other lads running along the bank were watching the scene in consternation. "He'll never make it," declared Jerry. "The current is much too strong for him." They could see Joe's tense face as he pitted his strength against the force of the current and desperately strove to make it his way towards the bank. He was still clinging to the boy, who was commencing his struggles anew. They were beginning to be swept closer to the rapids every moment. There was a number of rocks rising above the surface of the river just a few feet ahead, and beyond that was a smooth, deep, swiftly flowing sheet of water that swept past the willows at the bend and ended in a quarter of a mile of rough, turbulent water, rapids, and falls. "I'm going to help him," exclaimed Frank suddenly. He stopped on the bank and flung off his coat then started to untie his shoelaces in order to kick his light shoes aside. But in the meantime, Joe had managed to catch at a projecting rock with his free hand, so Chet put a restraining hand on Frank's arm. For a moment it seemed that the current would make Joe loose his grip, but he clung to the rock and drew himself closer until he had wrapped his arm about it. The rest of the rock was wide and flat, and lay just a few inches beneath the surface. Slowly, Joe climbed on to this precipice of refuge, dragging the half-conscious boy with him. The rock was big enough to provide foothold for them both. The boy was unable to help himself, as he was limp and weak from his experience. Just as he was almost on the rock, Joe lost his grip on the lad's collar for a second, and the current whirled him to one side. The lad toppled backward, striking his head on the rock, but Joe made a frantic grab for him. At imminent risk of precipitating himself into the water again, his fingers closed about the back of the lad's shirt, and he managed to haul the boy to safety once more. But the blow had rendered the lad unconscious. He lay limply on the flat rock, with the water breaking about his body, while Joe, his clothes drenched, clung to him. "Get help! Get a rope!" Joe shouted to his companions on the bank. Frank and Chet lost no time. They fled back towards the old mill. The affair in the river had passed unnoticed by the millers, and when Chet and Frank rushed up to the front door, they found no one in sight. "I'm going inside," declared Frank. "We'll have to get a rope, or they'll be swept off that rock in no time." The door was closed, but he pushed it open and entered the dim interior of the mill. But hardly had he stepped inside, with Chet at his heels, than he ran into the arms of one of the men whom he had seen outside the doorway some time previously. "Hi, what do you want?" demanded the man, angrily. He seized Frank by the shoulders and tried to push him back out of the building. At the same time, the other man came running out of a nearby door. "What's going on here?" he shouted wrathfully. "What's all this about? Get out of here, you boys!" The sound of voices evidently attracted the attention of the third man, for he too came running out of the shadows carrying a heavy club, which he brandished threateningly. "What do you want here?" he shouted excitedly. He was short and broad-shouldered, with a dirty kerchief knotted about his neck. "We want a rope," Frank explained, taken aback by the hostile demonstration. "Your boy is drowning in the mill race." Three men became immediately concerned. They crowded about, asking questions. "What boy? Where is he? What do you want a rope for?" "He fell into the river a few minutes ago. If we don't hurry, he'll be drowned. My brother rescued him, and they're both on the rock down near the rapids," Frank said hurriedly. "Get a rope, quick!" "Get a rope, Markle," shouted the old man to the fellow with the club. "Hurry up!" Markle dropped the club and ran back into the room from which he had come. In a few moments he returned, dragging a length of stout rope. "Where is he now?" asked the old man. "Lead the way." The men of the old mill had forgotten their first animosity when told of the plight of the boy, and now they followed Chet and Frank as the two boys ran outside again and raced along the banks to the place where the other boys were standing in an excited group, shouting advice and encouragement to Joe, who was still clinging to the rock. Markle stumbled along the bank with the rope, and when he reached the group of boys, they moved back to give him space. He coiled the rope loosely in one hand and then whirled the free end of it about his head and flung it out into the stream. But the rope fell short. Joe made a feeble grab for it, but Markle had misjudged the distance. "Here, let me try," demanded the older one of the three men, pushing Markle impatiently to one side. He seized the loose end of the rope, drew the remainder of it through the rushing water, and then cast it out to Joe. The rope whirled through the air, missed Joe's outreached fingers by inches, and then splashed into the water. Again the older man drew the rope back. Again he swung it about his head, and again it arched out above the river. This time it fell against Joe's shoulders, and the youth, still clinging to the unconscious form on the rock, hastily grabbed at it, seized it, and began hastily tying it about his shoulders underneath his arms. He was handicapped by the fact that he had but one arm free, but at last he had the rope securely knotted. The old man was greatly excited. He had noticed that the boy had not moved, and that Joe had to cling to him to keep him from being swept off the rock. "Lester!" he shouted. "Lester, are you all right?" "He hit his head on a rock and is knocked out," explained Jerry. "I don't think he's badly hurt." At that moment Joe looked up and waved to them as a signal that they could begin towing them ashore. He tightened his hold on the unconscious boy and eased himself off the rock. The old man, Frank, and Markle seized the end of the rope, and as Joe released his hold of the rock, they began to pull. The rope was an old one, and Frank noticed with alarm that it was worn and frayed. Would it hold? The figures in the water bobbed up and down in the waves, sometimes submerged completely. Bit by bit they were drawn towards the bank. But their combined weight and the strength of the current proved too much for the rope. When they were but a few yards from shore, the rope abruptly snapped. The men and the boys on the bank staggered back as the loose end of the rope spun through the air. Joe and Lester were swept away in the swift current.